It's time for another episode of Gospel Preaching Live, brought to you by the Kearney Church of Christ, which meets at 406 North Clark in Kearney, Missouri. Make plans to come out and visit the brethren, who look forward to seeing you. And now the host of Gospel Preaching Live, Richard Dodson.
Welcome to Gospel Preaching Live. My name is Richard Dodson, and I preach for the Kearney Church of Christ in Kearney, Missouri. You're always welcome to be our honored guest at Kearney. We meet at 406 North Clark in Kearney, Missouri, and hopefully when you hear this lesson on the radio, then you'll be willing to come down at 9:30 join our Bible study, and 10:30 for our worship service, and then you can hear another lesson from God's Word. You would always be our honored guest. We try to come to you each week on KPGZ Radio, 102.7 FM in Kearney, Missouri, at 8 a.m. Central Time. Now, if you cannot pick up the signal, you can go to their website or download the station's app, and you'll be able to pick us up then, because they do stream the signal. But needless to say, we try to come to you each week, and we hope the lesson is edifying. All that we ask is that you check the message out with God's Word to make sure that it is so. And if you find out that the message is not a part of God's Word, then we would be eternally grateful if you'd point that out to us. And you can always write to us at gospelpreachinglive@gmail.com, gospelpreachinglive@gmail.com. Perhaps there's a lesson that you would like to hear, or perhaps there's just a comment that you'd like to make, or a correction that you feel like we've made a mistake in. Whatever we can do to be of service, we're here to help. So we do pray that you will tune in each and every week. Again, that's KPGZ Radio, 102.7 FM in Kearney, Missouri. All right, this lesson I want to bring to you is called An Acceptable Sacrifice, and it has to do with our giving. You know, I've come across many people who feel like they do have to give. They do feel like they need to put money in the plate when the plate comes around at church. But sometimes they feel like it doesn't have to be to the particular church they belong to. And they feel like they can send that money to wherever they may want to send it. And of course, there's been a lot of questions about that and what the scriptures teach. And we've had from time to time people who have sent us money to put in the collection plate instead of sending it to the church that they belong to. And that question was brought up to me, and I was asked what I thought of it. I will say this: I don't have any problems right up front with someone who's visiting a church and they want to give. They can give as they want. I mean, we don't have a roster at church that we go through, and we don't, we pass the plate to everybody. And if somebody wants to put money in it, that's up to them. However, I do feel like the scriptures teach that we have a responsibility to give to the church that we are a part of. So I have to make a determination what I want to give to the Lord, and I need to make sure that money is given to the Lord. Now, there are some Sundays when I'm not at church, the church at Kearney. I may be preaching some other place. Now, does that mean I don't put money in the plate? Well, I do put money in the plate at Kearney, because I make plans to make sure that my contribution is placed in the collection plate at Kearney. However, I may go above and beyond that by putting in a whatever amount of money at the church that I may be visiting, and I don't see that there's a problem with that. I can choose to use my money as I see fit. But as for the sacrifice that I make at church on Sunday morning, that needs to be with the church that I am associated with. And we'll talk about that a little bit more as we get into the lesson. Okay, in Philippians chapter 4 and verse 18, I want to look at some passages to show how our offering is very much comparable in language and practice even to the sacrifices the Jews made under the Old Testament, under the Mosaic Law. In Philippians chapter 4 and verse 18, Paul is speaking about a gift that he received, support from another church that the Philippian church that was helping him in his ministry. He says, "Indeed, I have all and abound. I am full, having received from Epaphroditus the things sent from you, a sweet smelling aroma, an acceptable sacrifice, well pleasing to God." Now, this money was collected and this money was sent to Paul by the hands of Epaphroditus. And it is called a sweet. Now, remember, Paul's speaking by inspiration. So these are God's words. It is a sweet smelling aroma, an acceptable sacrifice, and it's declared to be well pleasing to God. Those are the same types of languages that we see in the Old Testament concerning the burnt offerings that we see the Israelites performing in the Mosaical law. And I think there is a comparison to be made between those offerings and those that we see the Christians practicing in the New Testament. Now, in 1 Peter 2 and verse 5, and I only say this by way of reminder, we are told that we are to offer up, Christians are, spiritual sacrifices acceptable to God through Jesus Christ. And so we can understand then that the offering that we give to God, as the monies that's being collected when the plate is passed on Sunday, that particularly is a spiritual sacrifice. And we need to make sure it is acceptable to God. By Moses? No. By Jesus Christ. We listen to the orders of Jesus Christ. Now, it was important if the Israelites wanted their sacrifices to be acceptable to God, it had to be acceptable through Moses because Moses was the lawgiver. But Jesus is the lawgiver to the Christians. And so such spiritual sacrifices have to be acceptable to God by our listening to and obeying the words of Jesus Christ. In Hebrews chapter 13 and verse 16, it says, "Do not forget to do good and to share, for such sacrifices God is well pleased." Now, again, this is something that he's talking about, our sharing, our giving. And he says this is a sacrifice. Our giving is a sacrifice, and God is well pleased with that. And I only bring up these passages by way of introduction so we would have an idea exactly what the Lord intended us to learn from those in the Old Testament when we compare it to the New Testament Christian. Now let's move on. I want to look at the Old Covenant priest because there's much that we can learn from them and their offerings to God. And so the first and foremost, and the thing I want to really emphasize, and I hope these scriptures will display that for you, is that in order for these sacrifices to be acceptable to God, they had to follow his rules. Now, remember, I said they had to follow Moses. Moses was the lawgiver, and God gave Moses the rules. And so Moses just relayed God's laws to the Jews, and they had to follow those laws in order to make sure that their sacrifices were acceptable to God. Let's look at a couple of passages. First of all, I want us to notice that it was important just for following rules, who it was that even performed this sacrifice. Numbers chapter 3, and we'll look at two verses. One's in verse 3 and one's in verse 10. It says in verse 3, the names of the sons of Aaron, the anointed priest, whom he consecrated to minister as priest. And what he is saying is, in order for someone to be a priest under the law of Moses, they had to be of the Levitical tribe. They had to be a son of Aaron. That's who made up the Levitical tribe. And so you had to be of the tribe of Levi in order to be a Levitical priest. Verse 10 says, so you shall appoint Aaron and his sons, and they shall attend to their priesthood. But the outsider who comes near shall be put to death. So we can understand then that it's very important for them to recognize who it was that was to perform the sacrifice. And it had to be the anointed priest, and that was those of the tribe of Levi. Nobody could perform these without penalty. And I've got a couple of examples for you. If you look at King Uzziah in Second Chronicles, and I believe it's chapter 26. Look at verses 16 through 21. King Uzziah was somebody who actually accomplished a great deal, but he got lifted up with pride, and he went in to perform the duties of a priest. He was not of the tribe of Levi. And the priests confronted him, and they told him, "You don't have any part or business in this." But he didn't care. He was Uzziah. He was lifted up with pride, and leprosy appeared before him because the Lord struck him. And so he had to flee from they chased him out of the house, but he knew the Lord struck him. He left, and he had to stay in a leper's house the rest of his life because he had leprosy. So you can see how important it was for Uzziah, the king, to be able to respect the rules of God and let those do the tasks that God appointed. Now, there is another one that I believe an even better example than King Uzziah, and that's Jesus Christ. If we go to Hebrews chapter 7 and look at verses 11 through 14, we see that Jesus could not have been and performed as a priest in the Old Testament. Now, remember, when Jesus lived, he was a Jew. And so you would think Jesus could go in and perform the duties of a priest, but he could not. And the reason was, as this text shows, he was of the tribe of Judah. But it goes on to say that, he is a priest now. And since he is a priest, then the law had to have changed. And that's the whole point that the Hebrew writers trying to make throughout the whole book, is that the law they were now under the law of Christ, not under the law of Moses. And because Jesus was a priest now, and he could not have been a priest under the Old Testament. And so we see that because Jesus came from the tribe of Judah, and God did not authorize anyone to be a priest under the tribe of Judah, that Jesus himself could not have been priest when he walked the earth. The law had to change in order for him to be a priest. And so we can see under that old law, God made a rule, and he made sure that even the kings could not violate it, or the Son of God himself could not violate it. He had to respect that law. Now, we read about these rules in Leviticus. The first 7 chapters of Leviticus, you can read about the rules concerning the various burnt offerings, sacrifices that the Israelites were to perform. In Leviticus chapter 7 and verse 37 through 38, it kind of sums up those first 7 chapters by saying this is the law of the burnt offering, the grain offering, the sin offering, the trespass offering, the consecrations, and the sacrifice of the peace offering, which the Lord commanded on Mount Sinai on the day when he commanded the children of Israel to offer their offerings to the Lord in the wilderness of Sinai. So we can see then that there was a law concerning these things, and they had to respect that law. Everything had to be done as the Lord instructed. We have an example of a couple of priests who did not follow that law. Leviticus chapter 10, 1 and 2 tells us about Nadab and Abihu. These were sons of Aaron, and each one of them took his censer and put fire in it, and he put incense on it and offered profane fire before the Lord. And this is the key point, which the Lord had not commanded them. And so fire went out from the Lord and devoured them, and they died before the Lord. You see, they did not follow the instructions to the letter as the Lord had told Moses to tell the people. And so since they did not respect the law of the Lord struck them dead. And that's something we have to understand. This is a very serious operation. This is something the Lord expects his rules to be followed. And so we have to respect the will of God, no matter what he may command. But when it comes to such sacrifices, we have to understand God's ways have to be followed. We are not someone who has the right to violate his instructions. Now let's think about the new covenant priest. we're going to flip gears now. We're going to talk about the Christian, because there's much the Christian can learn as we look back in time and look at those old covenant priests, because there is a comparison there. First of all, we're going to see that Christians have been made priests. They're declared to be priests in the Bible. Let's look at a couple of passages. 1 Peter chapter 2 and verse 9 says, "You are a chosen generation, a royal priesthood, a holy nation, his own special people, that you may proclaim the praises of him who called you out of darkness into his marvelous light." Again, this is another good example. If we Christians are a chosen generation, a royal priesthood, again, there had to be a change of the law, because we could not have been priests under the old law. We are not of the tribe of Levi, but we are now priests. And so as Jesus is a priest, we are priests. And so we see that in 1 Peter chapter 2 and verse 9. Revelations chapter 1, verse 5 and 6 says, "To him who loved us and washed us from our sins in his own blood, and has made us kings and priests to his God and Father, to him be glory and dominion forever and ever." We are now priests. And so we can see then that we also have to follow God's rules. One more passage to show this in Revelation chapter 5 and verse 9 and 10 says, "They sang a new song, saying, 'You are worthy to take the scroll and to open its seals, for you were slain, and having redeemed us to God by your blood out of every tribe and tongue and people and nation, and have made us kings and priests to our God, we shall reign on the earth.'" Christians are priests. And so with that, we can easily go back in time and look at the comparisons and learn what was expected of the priests then and what needs to be expected now. Now, while the laws may be different, we don't have such laws that you see in Leviticus, the first 7 chapters. We do have their examples. We do have the examples of how the command was given. We have the examples of how the command was enforced. It had to be carried out, and it had to be carried out according to the command. And we see how that was enforced. And so with that, we need to be warned that we need to carry out commands the Lord gives us in the same manner. Now, when I was talking earlier about an acceptable sacrifice, if you go to 1 Samuel chapter 3, and you're going to find out, you're going to read about Eli. And Eli had 2 sons who were priests. Eli was a priest. He had 2 sons that were priests, and they were not good people. And they were taking and asking people who brought their burnt offering to cut off certain parts for their own consumption. How it was to be done was they were supposed to take a 3-pronged, I don't know what you call those things, trident, I guess, stick it into the meat as it boils, and whatever they pulled out is what they kept. That's not what they wanted. They wanted the good stuff. And it said because of that, the people hated their sacrifice, meaning that they weren't doing it right, and they were causing people to stumble. Now, I understand that sometimes money's being spent by elders or whoever's making the decision, the men of the church, may not be acceptable to God. But that cannot allow us to hate our sacrifice. We have to give as the Lord has commanded us to give. There's 2 different things that need to be discussed. One is how the money is spent. Is the money spent in accordance with God's instructions? That's one issue. And sometimes we don't have any power over that. We have to work on that outside of the offering. But then we also have to focus on what we're doing. Are we giving as the Lord instructed? And see, that's the problem, because a lot of people now have decided, well, I don't like how the elders are spending their money. I'm going to send my money elsewhere. No, that's not acceptable. And I believe Eli's sons proved that. They are causing elders who are making bad decisions with the money are causing people's sacrifices to be unacceptable to God because they're practicing such things. That's a horrible thing. Now let's get back let's talk about how we actually are to give. There has to be a willingness on our part. In 2 Corinthians chapter 8, verse 3 through 5, Paul said, I bear witness that according to the Macedonians' ability, and yes, beyond their ability, they were freely willing and imploring us with much urgency that we would receive the gift of the fellowship to the ministering to saints. And not only as we had hoped for, they first gave themselves to the Lord and to us by the will of God. They were willing. They not only willing, they wanted to be a part of it. They wanted to give. They saw that this was the type of attitude they had, and they're being praised for this. They're being set up to be an example for all of us. And that's what we need to look at. This is not something we should look at with dread. This is something we should look at with anticipation. In Acts chapter 5 and verse 4 with Ananias and Sapphira, if you remember, they sold land and they made it look like they were giving everything to the apostles, but they didn't. They held back a part. And so when they were brought in separately, each one was asked about this. And Peter said this, he said, while the money remained, he goes, was it not your own? That's important. After it was sold, was it not in your control? And he said, why have you conceived this thing in your heart? You have not lied to men, but to God. In other words, their attitude wasn't right. Their heart wasn't right. They were in it for some other reason other than what the Lord wants. And they could have given of themselves as the Macedonians did, but they didn't do that. And so because of that, they lost their lives. In 2 Corinthians chapter 9 and verse 7, we're told how we're supposed to give. It says, let each one give as he purposes in his heart, not grudgingly or necessity, for God loves a cheerful giver. In other words, you determine what you're going to give. Now, everybody's heart may be different. Everybody has to grow in one way or another. There may be a poor man who ends up giving more money than a rich man, but they both may have, their heart in the right place. They both may give acceptable to God. And you may think to yourself, how is that possible? Well, one is just more spiritually mature than the other one, but at least they're giving as they're supposed to give. Now, the rich man needs to he needs to work on his faith a little more and learn to give better. But needless to say, he is giving as he purposed in his heart. He's not giving grudgingly. He's not giving of necessity. He is a cheerful giver. And that's what the Lord's looking for. And we have to understand that amount of money is different with everybody. And we shouldn't be judging people by how much money they give. We only are supposed to pass the plate. And then this sacrifice is given by Christians as they have purposed in their heart. Now, this is really similar to Leviticus with the Old Testament priests. Look what they did in Leviticus 1, 2, and 3. Speak to the children of Israel and say to them, when any one of you brings an offering to the Lord, you shall bring your offering of the livestock, of the herd of the flock. If his offering is a burnt sacrifice of the herd, let him offer a male without blemish. He shall offer it of his own free will at the door of the tabernacle and meeting before the Lord. Of his own free will. Isn't that similar to what the Christian does when the plate is passed? They give of their own free will. They don't give grudgingly. They give as the Lord wants them to give. In 2 Corinthians chapter 8, verse 12 through 13, to further emphasize that, it says, if there is first a willing mind, it is accepted, according to what one has, and not according to what he does not have. For I do not mean that others should be eased and you burdened, meaning that he doesn't want someone to give beyond what they need. I mean, they just want them to give as they purpose in their heart, but he doesn't want somebody's necessities to be fulfilled while you present a necessity upon yourself by your giving. But you got to have a willing mind. You got to be willing to give, first of all. Now, the passages that govern this is in 1 Corinthians 16:2. And it says, on the first day of the week, let each one of you lay something aside, storing up as he may prosper, that there be no collections when I come. I believe King James says, giving as you have prospered. And I believe that's the proper interpretation of that. So on the first day of the week, let each one of you give as he has prospered, that there be no collections when I come. So in other words, if you haven't made any money, then the Lord doesn't expect you to give. But if you have made money that week, then the Lord expects you to give. And that's something that the Lord has given to us in 1 Corinthians 16 and verse 2. Now, notice what he says in verse 1 of 1 Corinthians 16. He says, concerning the collection for the saints, as I have given orders to the churches of Galatia, he says this, so you must do also. He is talking to the Corinthian church. And he is making it clear that this is an order. This is something you have to do. Whenever you see that word must, you got to understand this is binding upon you. This is a binding upon the church, not just in Corinth, but also to the churches of Galatia, and by application, all of the local Lord's churches as well. They have to give on the first day of the week. Each one has to give. Now, we see that on verse 2. It says, on the first day of the week, let each one of you lay something aside, storing up as he may prosper, there be no collections when I come. Let each one of you, so each member who has been prospered partakes in that collection, not somebody else's collection. You partake in that collection of the church you are a part of. Now, something else we see here is also a treasury, because they had to have a place to put the money. Where'd they put the money? Well, they had to have some place to store it, because he says, let there be no collections. He wanted this done so there'd be no collections when I come. There had to be a place to put the money. And so I've heard some people argue against treasuries. Well, this by implication authorizes treasuries. In 1 Corinthians 16 and verse 6, we have the understanding that this monies that were collected were not just for the needy saints in Jerusalem. There are some who try to make the argument that the only collection that can be used is for needy saints. Well, if you're going to say that, then you're going to have to say that they can only be used for needy saints in Jerusalem. Any other needy saint would be outside of the realm of what's authorized. What we look at is application. And so we see a work of the church that they are collecting for, but that's not the only work they had. If we read just a few verses down, the church is told to send Paul on his journey. He says, and it may be that I will remain, in verse 6, 1 Corinthians 16, or even spend the winter with you, that you may send me on my journey wherever I go. They are going to finance that. So they had an opportunity before them that they did not have before. And then in 1 Corinthians 16, verse 10 and 11, we see that they're instructed also to send Timothy on his journey. They had to finance that. Now think about that. There are opportunities that are now presented to them that they didn't know that they had. Some people think, well, our church has so much money that I don't have to give, because if I'll give to a church that needs the money. No, you don't know what opportunities the Lord's going to send your way. Here are two examples of opportunities that were sent to the Corinthian church that they didn't have until Paul started talking to them about this. And so we have to be prepared to take advantage of these opportunities. And that's why there is a collection on the first day of the week, and so that a treasury could be built up. And when the opportunities arise, we are available to be able to partake in that work. I hope you've enjoyed this lesson. It had to be about offering an acceptable sacrifice to the Lord with the giving that we do on the first day of the week. And I do hope it's been beneficial to you. Listen, come down to Kearney Church of Christ, 406 North Clark. You will learn all about the church by going to kearneychurch.com. And don't forget, next Sunday, we'll be here again at 102.7 FM, KPGZ, at 8 a.m. Central Time You can also hear Gospel Preaching Live on Spotify on all the podcast formats, and just look for Gospel Preaching Live and it should pop up. Okay, until next time, remember, this is the day the Lord has made. Let's rejoice in it and be glad.
This has been Gospel Preaching Live. Join us each week as truth is taught, faith is examined, and beliefs are challenged. Be sure and hit the like button so you can be notified of future episodes. And to watch past episodes, go to our website, kearneychurch.com. This has been a work of the Kearney Church of Christ.